and so there was a positive side here. And I'm delighted to welcome Marco Antonio Sousa Alves to the Surveillance Studies seminar series. Marco is an assistant professor of theory and philosophy of law at the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. He's got a PhD from the same university, but also with a component from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris. He's the author editor of several books and coordinator of groups studying information society and algorithmic government and philosophy, law and power within UFMG. And he's going to be a visiting scholar at the Surveillance Studies Center here at Queen's until May. So can I welcome Marco?
Okay, well, thank you. I would like to start by thanking you for this opportunity. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be able to dialogue with you. I would like to thank especially Professor David Lyon for accepting me here at Queen's University, and David Murakami Wood and John Sharp and Emily Smith for the kindly welcome. I know we live a hard time. Unfortunately, we are still forced to maintain only virtual contacts. Nevertheless, I feel very welcome and happy to be here. In my talk today, I would like to address a very general question, a question that guides my studies for some years now. The aim is to analyze the emerging power regime that shapes a new society of surveillance, exposure, hate, and exclusion. My intention, quite ambitious, I have to admit, is to carry on the project of analyzing power outlined by Michel Foucault in the 1970s. That is a study that proposes to describe the way power works, the how of power, not a theory of what power is, with an emphasis on its rationality and the objects, tactics, and techniques involved. I start from the perception that today we are witnessing the emergence of a new regime of power, which still needs to be more properly described and understood, beyond sovereign power, discipline, and security. I believe that the new information and communication technologies, ICTs, shape a radically different world. We currently live in a new condition that is profoundly transforming our relations with each other and with ourselves. In saying this, however, I do not intend to defend a technological determinism, reducing all the complexity of the ongoing changes to a mere consequence of the appearance of this or that technological device. It is certainly important to consider social, economic, and political aspects to better understand the new emergent practices and the world we are building. Nevertheless, I believe that the introduction of ICTs, especially the widespread use of mobile internet and the boom of digital platforms, is crucial in understanding the new way power works in contemporary times. This is a well-known perception that guides my research for some years now. The study of ICTs came up and took place in my research agenda, especially since 2014, based on my training domain, which is contemporary political philosophy and especially the thought of Michel Foucault. During this investigation, that the problem of surveillance appeared to me more clearly. So I became aware of this large field of studies less than a decade ago, especially after having contact with David Lyon's work and the activities developed in the scope of LAVITS, the Latin American Network of Surveillance Technology and Society Studies. Thus, I'm still a beginner in this field. It's quite easy to understand why I'm here at Surveillance Studies Center, where I intend to learn more about this topic and go deeper into some issues. So I ask for your patience with this newcomer and his work in progress. It's more and more clear to me that surveillance is a key piece to understanding the way power works today. surveillance is closely linked to the shape capitalism has recently acquired, called surveillance capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, or platform capitalism by Nick Zrensek, and others, such as David Murakami Wood. And surveillance is also behind the new strategies of control and government, called algorithmic governmentality by Antoinette Revoy and Thomas Burns. And last but not least, surveillance shapes the constitution of a new culture, a new way of life based on self-exposure and generalized voyeurism. The culture of surveillance of David Lyon, or the expository society according to Bernard Harcourt. In short, the project of the analytics of power can only be properly conducted today if it takes seriously the new practices of surveillance. In fact, Foucault himself made a major contribution to the field of surveillance studies by analyzing the emergence of the disciplinary society based on panoptic model, and by describing the securitarian society and governmental devices. I consider that a new step is required and a great effort of updating must be undertaken. In short, we need to open a new path, develop new conceptual tools, and look at the new world through fresh lenses, pointing to a post-panoptic model and a post-securitarian society. I apologize for talking too much about myself and my research interests at the beginning of this talk. The weird situation we are facing today has led me to this. As a newcomer to Surveillance Study Center, without being able to enjoy the face-to-face meetings, I remain largely unknown. It's probably my first contact with many of you here. With this short opening words, I only want to say one thing. Nice to meet you. And I hope I have not been so inappropriate in bringing some coffee break conversation into this conference room. So let's go. I'm aware that the question I want to address here, that is the emergence of a power regime and new forms of surveillance, is extremely broad. I only intend to offer some general outlines, a kind of small scale map, far away from the details. The goal of this kind of mapping is to provide a broad view, a framework that allows us to better guide our future investigations. And the following presentation is composed of two parts. In the first section, I intend to follow Foucault's footsteps, especially his reflections on sovereign, disciplinary, and securitarian power, departing from analogies with city planning and sanitarian models. In the second part, I would like to go a step further and outline a new model or a scheme of understanding the emerging power regime. I want to emphasize the complexity and variations in the way power and surveillance operate in the contemporary world, with special attention to how the global North and the global South differ. By focusing more on global South and peripheral experiences, I argue that the way Bolsonaro's government is addressing the COVID-19 pandemic may provide a paradigmatic case. So I begin presenting the first point, following Foucault. In the first lessons of the course Sécurité, Territoire, Population, delivered in 1978 at the Collège de France, Foucault points at three different modes of operation of power and three distinct strategies: the instruments of sovereign power based on the juridical system, the disciplinary mechanisms based on permanent surveillance and individual correction, and the securitarian devices based on statistical surveys and probability calculations. To exemplify this, Foucault draws analogies in two different domains: strategies for dealing with contagious diseases and designs of urban organization. In short, the projects of a healthy community and a well-ordered city serve to illustrate the different ways in which power operates. Foucault's argument is constructed as follows. Let me change this. Okay. Well, first, I would like to present these models analyzed by Foucault and then think about our current experience and the new emergent models. Let's start with the power of sovereignty and the utopian city called La Métropolité, conceived in the 17th century by Alexandre Lemaitre, a project that, by the way, was never executed. In this project, everything is planned around the capital, a political and commercial center, and the territory is organized in function of a spot from where power irradiates. The city reflects the sovereign utopia, the image of a great centralized power. The Leprosy Model, on the other hand, is a medieval procedure based on a principle of a wide division, the logic of marking and binary partition. It is a power over a territory that sets a clear boundary. Lepers could only circulate outside the domains of the city. It is a logic of exclusion by enclosure. Lepers are sentenced to banishment. This causes the birth of a mass of excluded people and a series of practices of rejection. The logic is to separate these two large and confused masses. On one side, the lepers, on the other, the purified community. A set of measures is adopted to protect the city, such as building fortifications and walls. There is, therefore, the creation of an outside and outer space. Basically, juridical mechanisms are mobilized in this model of leprosy. Decrees declared individuals as lepers and imposed on them a variety of extremely severe prohibitions, constituting a true sentence of death. Underlying these actions of segregation and banishment, Foucault detects a political dream, the utopia of a pure community. The second project mentioned by Foucault is Richelieu's artificial city, which was effectively built from scratch in the 17th century, inspired by the disciplinary model of the Roman camps. In this city, space is planned and organized according to principles of hierarchic and functional distribution to ensure commerce, housing, and circulation in an idealized way. We are here at the heart of the disciplinary dream. The plague model goes in the same direction. Unlike the leper, who was simply expelled, the pestilent will no longer be banished. The sick person will remain within the domains of the city under the watchful eye of the guard. It is a modern, police-like approach that performs a controlled inclusion of the pestilent, the quarantine in which every individual has his or her place. The logic behind it is to avoid agglomerations, to prevent confusion, to distinguish between individuals. Instead of the opacity of the great medieval walls, transparency and individualization prevail in a panoptic structure. Instead of legal instruments, normalizing mechanisms are mobilized, such as examinations, scores, reports, and detailed inspections. A new dream arises, the completely disciplined, well-trained, tamed, and docile society. And finally, the third example mentioned by Foucault is that of the urbanization of Knunt in the 18th century, which aimed to eliminate disorderly agglomerations, illustrating a securitarian strategy. Based on statistical data, spaces were opened and streets enlarged, seeking to improve circulation and anticipate the growth of the city. Instead of starting from scratch and designing an artificial ideal city, the security devices work on something given, aiming to maximize the positive elements and minimize the risks and inconveniences. Perfection is no longer the goal. The aim is to efficiently manage a population. Analyzing the urban design of Knunt, Foucault observes the concern with hygiene, aiming to eliminate diseases, with the flow of commerce and circulation, as well as with public safety, the need to watch over and control the population of beggars and delinquents. It is clear how the political economy influences city planning in order to keep the undesired population away. The population is understood not in terms of a legal political notion of subject, but as a kind of object that must be governed according to specific demands, especially regarding the economy. The smallpox model, on the other hand, is introduced by Foucault in the lectures of 1978 as a new securitarian strategy of epidemic management. This is an economical and calculation-based approach to social control. An average of what is considered optimal or acceptable is fixed, and we act to modulate the contamination curves in their evolution. The strategy is to intervene in order to eliminate the trends that are seen as most unfavorable among different tendencies. We are facing what Foucault calls a game of differential normality. The mechanisms deployed are now of immunity type, vaccination practices, linked to a new demographic and epidemiological knowledge. The smallpox model is linked to a new dream, the construction of a safe, efficient, risk-controlled society. It is convenient to ask why Foucault turns to these city projects or disease-confronting models. It seems to me that these are domains in which we see our utopias most clearly. By designing a city or facing an epidemic, we render a more concrete and visible form to our dreams of social organizations. I think that epidemics are a kind of laboratory for social innovation, an appropriate moment for the reconfiguration of power technologies. It is about responding to an emergency, that this opens the door to new experiments and to the attempt to push forward new forms of control and government that, in normal situations, would hardly be admissible. Illness acts both in real and imaginary terms as a symbol of disorder, of confusion, that gives life to the will to put things back in their right place. Behind this desire to undo what has become messy, many political dreams are called into play. The dangers are not only of a sanitary nature, but also applicable to the design of a city. We are afraid of chaos and contagion. The securitarian logic spreads out to tackle all threats, which may take the form of riots, crimes, wandering, indiscipline, erratic behavior, and counter-conduct in general. In short, anything that escapes from what we consider normal or acceptable represents a threat. It's basically because of these fears that we imprison, exclude, marginalize, ban, kill, and label people, that we monitor, control, and manage populations, that we calculate risks, and so on. These are different ways of exercising power, of dealing with whatever is considered to be a threat to a certain order. Political fantasies come into play. The medieval dream, for example, is that of the great enclosure to take out all the impurities. The modern disciplinary dream is that of perfect training, of a world in which everyone is docile, useful, and productive. And finally, we have the neoliberal and securitarian dream, which is that of the efficient management of all risks. So we have different schemes, but they are not incompatible with each other. At this point, I would like to make a final observation. These models presented here are not enchained in the form of a mere sequence in time. Foucault was very clear about this on several occasions. These models articulate with each other. Security devices, for example, involve legal mechanisms as well as surveillance techniques of a disciplinary nature. These mechanisms are not eliminated. On the contrary, they are re-articulated within a new strategy of securitarian type. What changes is the correlation system between the different modes of power functioning. So I then move on to the second part of my talk. Let's go. The emerging power regime. So if the leprosy model, according to Foucault, is based on legal mechanisms, if the plague model is based on disciplinary instruments, and if the smallpox model relies on securitarian measures, I would say that the COVID-19 model relies on informational devices, big data practices, and operates in a double dynamic, marked by the production of self-entrepreneurs, as well as by the sacrificial logic and the elimination of the undesirables. Regarding the organization of cities, I propose two other models that illustrate this double dynamic. On the one hand, the utopia of the smart city, an intensively watched and controlled environment, supposedly more comfortable, safe, and efficient. And on the other hand, the new necropolises, exception camps, understood as spaces of exclusion of precarious and disposable lives. I suggest provisionally to call this new power regime data necropolitics. What's at stake in confronting COVID-19 has, in my view, a post-securitarian dimension, but keeping different aspects of neoliberal rationality. A new element, however, draws attention: the phenomenon of datification of life. A datificated life is a life reduced to data, quantified, captured by mobile devices and social networks, driven by algorithms of high complexity, incited to expose itself, and led to consume and incessantly optimize itself. I would like, in the following, to further reflect on the main features of this phenomenon, on the dreams mobilized and the emergent utopia of social construction. Okay, so in this table, I just summarize the main points of my argument. I will leave it filling the screen and give some close-ups. Well, right from the start, it is important to remember that the COVID-19 model, which is marked by datification of life, implies a rearrangement of traditional forms of power. They all remain operative in some way. We have something of the leper exclusion model and the dream of a peers community. For example, in isolating, building safe zones, locking borders, and deportation. We also mobilize the disciplinary model of the plague and the wish for a well-trained and docile society through control of movement, permanent surveillance, and meticulous registration, as well as operating the smallpox model and the dream of a well-managed society with controlled risks through statistics, the flattering of the curve, analysis of epidemiological development trends, and risk calculations. What changes in COVID-19's model is the correlation system between these different modes of power functioning. Perhaps, so let me change this, okay. Perhaps the main novelties are in the new forms of surveillance, such as GPS tracking of movements and the ability to obtain individualized biometrical data in real time, the so-called under-skin surveillance. Behind this, a new technocratic dream seems to emerge, the utopia of an information society governed by algorithms. We, therefore, combine different political strategies. Some of these strategies are more repressive, prohibitive, or imposing. Others are more constitutive, productive, positive. In this last sense, we have a more insidious power and a more imperceptible and efficient surveillance. The algorithmic governmentality based on data valence, data mining, and profiling. The constitutive or positive functioning of the new power regime is associated with the production of the neoliberal subject, taken as a self-entrepreneur who behaves mediated by new technologies in order to improve his performance, to increase his productivity, and to be more and more successful in a competitive environment. We are free to be entrepreneurs, but the exercise of this freedom involves a wide submission to a system of control and normalization, new devices and services based on massive data extraction, profiling, and behavioral modification. We seek personalized services which optimize our actions and allow for increased efficiency. So we surrender to coaching, fitness, and platform capitalism. We not only accept resignedly the control of our lives, but we also in large measure participate enthusiastically in this new culture of surveillance. Different surveillance practices, panoptic or synoptic, coexist within a culture marked by scopophilia, voyeurism, and exhibitionism. That is the desire to see everything and the pleasure of being seen. A new utopia of city planning arises here, the smart city, which is the city that uses integrated technologies to achieve higher efficiency in the management of resources, mobility, and services. The declared goal of these projects is to provide greater well-being through a more comfortable, efficient, and safer experience of the city, with more intelligent control of flows and widespread security. The dream mobilized here is to build an increasingly productive and harmonious social life with minimal loss, waste, and damage. The notion of a smart city is extremely recent, tracking back to the early 21st century, when the idea of Internet of Things began to take shape, pointing to an experience of digitalization and global connection capable of extending beyond cyberspace, involving things in general and the urban space. Okay, in short, the smart city is born from the possibility of large amounts of data being produced all the time by its inhabitants and all kinds of things. In these smart cities, we are treated basically as consumers or users. We are rarely seen as citizens in the sense of free subjects who can take part in collective decisions. It is a kind of new digital technocracy that revives the dream of solving the problem of politics through technology, replacing deliberation by calculation. Instead of the hard and the slow work of building a democratic life in common, the emphasis is on the fast and efficient solution of the new intelligent machines. The city becomes another service offered by large corporations without any substantive regulation or state intervention. This way of functioning of power has a ubiquitous and imperceptible dimension, operating in a practically invisible way as a soft power, which does not appear in an imperative form, such as a law or a commandment that establishes prohibitions and limits. We are surveilled without having a clear perception of it. We are also directed in our actions without being clearly aware of it. Algorithmic government and data behaviorism function through a multiplicity of devices for control, classification, evaluation, prediction, and driving. It governs outside the laws, the democratic game, and the conflict. As Thomas Burns argues, we have a kind of governmental mediocrity that is supposedly harmless, efficient, and simple politics that does not touch, does not force, and is based on data, acting in real time. It governs as if it were not governing at the margins of traditional politics. I believe that this has been the dimension emphasized by a large part of the thinkers of our time. For example, Shoshana Zuboff, when dealing with instrumentalist power, David Lyle, when analyzing the surveillance culture, Bernard Harcourt, when describing the new expositor society, Thomas Burns, when reflecting on the new government of relations, Byung-Chul Han, when presenting psychopolitics, or Nick Codry and Ulisses Merias, when addressing the new data colonialism. In short, it is argued that power tends to function in contemporary times in a non-imposing way, without the need to say no, without explicit prohibitions, employing a more insidious governing strategy, which shapes environments and directs our behaviors in ways we are unable to perceive or resist. At the same time, power induces pleasures and relies on our active and passionate participation. More than being surveilled by a state or a great external and authoritarian power, we are involved in a new way of life in which we are incessantly seen and being seen, one by another, shaping a diffuse, multiple, generalized, and naturalized surveillance. We are certainly observed, but above all, we show ourselves, we exhibit ourselves at every moment in our smallest details. Even if I agree with this diagnosis, I understand that it misses or does not assign sufficient concern to other dimensions of the function of power and surveillance practices today. Sometimes we have the impression that imposing repressive and clearly violent ways in which power operates are nothing more than traces of a past, a kind of ruin that tends to be overcome over time. I think this is a way of thinking centered on a global north perspective, which is not sufficiently attentive to the complexity and contradictions that lie at the heart of how power operates in the world today, including in the global north itself, since there is a south within the north. This vision, centered in the global north, reminds that of the enlightened modern man who saw colonization as a process of expanding civilization, as if the former colonies would tend to become closer over time to the liberal societies of the main European centers. The enlightened European was unable to perceive the proper nature of the colonial enterprise, the plantation regime, and modern slavery. His thinking about modernity generally does not include the phenomenon of colonization, which remains the hidden, dirty side. As Achille Mbembe argues, we cannot forget that modernity also invented necropolitics, which was widely experienced in the global south. Europe's liberal experience not only lived with the politics of colonial terror, it presupposes the colony. Thus, modernity is characterized by the affirmation of human rights, by democratic improvements, and by the promotion of social welfare policies. It is also, as its presupposition, marked by modern slavery, authoritarianism, and necropolitics. I believe it is essential to look more closely at this overtly repressive or negative dimension of the contemporary mode of power operation. One facet of this can be seen in the Chinese model, which employs a more centralized state surveillance and enforces an explicitly coercive power. Nevertheless, the Chinese experience should not simply be understood in terms of a totalitarian regime, as we saw in the 20th century, but as a new path opened by surveillance capitalism, which with a more clearly authoritarian bias. China exemplifies an alternative model that seeks global hegemony and increasingly competes with the big techs of Silicon Valley. I would like to draw my attention in different direction to the marginal experiences on the other side of data colonialism. I understand that the authoritarian drift is strongly felt in the global South, conforming to what Killing Bambi has called societies of enmity, marked by the crisis of liberal democracy, especially in countries with a weakened institutional environment, and by a panoptic logic, to use a term coined by Didier Bigot to describe how surveillance operates in the form of exclusion and banishment. We have in operation today a new post-colonial necropolitics, a power of death and elimination associated with a new kind of racism, aimed at the exclusion of those who are considered undesirable and useless, who do not consume or undertake. Our time favors, in Bambi's view, separation, hatred, and hostility towards the others. Today, the logic of enclosure and the fantasy of segregation and even extermination flourish. Necropolitics tends to become hegemonic nowadays through a process that in Bambi called becoming black of the world, conceived in close relationship with the advance of neoliberal rationality. In short, we live in a context favorable to violence responses where neoliberalism meets authoritarianism. A colonial logic is reactivated, dehumanizing those who are deviant or unproductive. We remain in the proximity of a genocidal state. A new dystopian city emerges as well. Not exactly the smart cities, supposedly more comfortable and efficient. We also desire a kind of necropolis, a militarized city, a fortified enclave that expresses in urbanistic and architectural terms the dream of social segregation and purification. These walls may be physical, but they are mostly virtual, involving cameras, sensors, digital markers, trackers, and drones. Like the old communists, with their fortress and slave quarters, a new type of trading post is being built today. In line with the new phase assumed by capitalism, we see the emergence of a high-tech control and the new machine of data extraction, appropriation of bodies, and exploitation, as well as new spaces of exception. In short, which political dream is emerging? What kind of social utopia is being experienced in the confrontation of COVID-19? It seems to me that it is largely a technocratic dream, a dream of digital modeling of reality, the utopia of reducing everything to data. A dream of a humanity completely transparent to itself. A social utopia that emerges, therefore, from a digitized, visible, registered, secure, comfortable society. We dream of being guided to success, of having an efficient governing of our conduct, which promises to eliminate whatever is undesirable or unwelcome. Thus, we dream of a kind of smart necropolis, a city of free enterprise for the few and exclusion for the many. It reminds, to some degree, the dystopia imagined by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, based on the distinction between the savages, an excluded and precarious mass struggling to survive on the periphery, And on the other hand, we are urged to participate and passionately assume a new way of life based on exhaustive surveillance, customization, algorithmic governing of our behaviors, and the optimization of self. On the other hand, we are addressed as an undesirable waste, a useless and threatening mess that needs to be controlled and, if required, eliminated. On both fronts, constitutive or repressive, politics in its traditional sense is undermined, be it because the spaces of deliberation are affected by the new technocratic ideal and the information management of life, or because new authoritarianisms emerge where dialogue was being impoverished, allowing the revival of the hate and the desire for separation and eradication of the undesirable. I agree on this point with the association made by Wendy Brown between neoliberal rationality, moral conservatism, and new authoritarianism. Far from being an incidental effect, this suppression of democracy is seen as a fundamental element of the neoliberal program, which points to an authoritarian technocratic regime as the appropriate form of government for the new stage of capitalism. In brief, I believe that we are facing a new regime of power that cannot be reduced to its merely conservative or constitutive or repressive dimension. Just as Foucault did in his analysis of the Nazi state in the course Il faut défendre la société, delivered at the Collège de France in 1976, articulating biopower focused on the production of life with the old sovereign power of death, I understand that a new articulation of this nature is currently being established. We are again led to a paradoxical situation and guided by a warrior logic. So let me finish with some final remarks. I would like to close my talk by making a brief reference to the Brazilian government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, which can, in my perception, serve as a dramatic and sharp example. While exceeding 600,000 deaths, 620,000 deaths, according to official numbers, probably underestimated, the focus of our president's discourse remains centered on the economy, as if we should put our lives at risk for the good of the country and to play our patriotic role. A warrior logic is activated in its double dimension, eliminating enemies and exposing our own lives to the risk of death. Several declarations by Bolsonaro during the pandemic illustrate this. For example, and I apologize for saying these words, but I'm trying to preserve the offensive tone of his statements, and I will read them in Portuguese and translate in the sequence. And I quote, "Chega de frescura, de mimimi, vão ficar chorando até quando? No more fagging, no more complaining. How long are you going to cry?" And another, "O Brasil tem que deixar de ser um país de maricas. Brazil should stop being a country of sissies. According to Bolsonaro's logic, anyone who protects herself is a coward who harms the economy." I quote again, "Essa é uma realidade, o vírus está aí, vamos ter que enfrentá-lo, mas enfrentar como homem, porra, não como moleque. É a vida, todos nós iremos morrer um dia." The translation, "This is the reality. The virus is there. We must face it, but face it like a man, damn it, not like a brat. There are the way life is. We are all going to die one day." Besides urging the population to take the risk of dying, like brave soldiers enlisted in a war in the name of the nation and the economy, instead of taking appropriate measures to protect their lives, several statements by President Bolsonaro express a striking disregard and insensitivity towards the number of lives lost. After being asked about the growing number of COVID-19 deaths in Brazil, Bolsonaro aggressively replies, "E daí, quer que eu faça o quê? So what? Do you want me to do what?" Or he replies, "Eu não sou coveiro. I'm not a grave digger." At this point, a clear messianic, warrior-like, and sacrificial dimension can be perceived in Bolsonarism, understood as a broader political movement that goes beyond the governmental actions themselves and finds several similar manifestations around the world. O Brasil não pode parar. Brazil cannot stop, says the slogan of the Brazilian federal government. We are called to go out and fight, each one for him or herself, affirming radically the freedom of the self-made man, preferably with a gun in hand. We must give our own lives in sacrifice if we are to survive and prosper as a nation. Anyone who resists to this new reality becomes a social enemy. Bolsonarism conducts a permanent culture war, feeding hate against the so-called communists, vagabonds, minorities, and also against academics and experts. As such, we retake a long tradition in Brazil, a country shaped by colonization, slavery, and extreme social inequality. The population is seen only as a disposable resource in the process of accumulation and concentration that cannot stop under any condition whatsoever. We reactivate again and again the same mechanism that is strongly linked to racist, genocidal, and suicidal fantasies. In this sense, Bolsonaro resumes a long tradition and embodies a new triumphant necropolitics, a necropolitics that is universalized, that goes beyond the senzalas, the slaves' quarters, and the favelas, the slums. A new pride is declared in daylight. The new conservative meets the successful entrepreneur under the umbrella of the new platform capitalism. We no longer worry about hiding the precariousness, the exclusion, the extermination, pretending that fundamental rights are respected and Republican institutions are functioning. Far from blushing, the Brazilian who supports Bolsonaro proudly exhibits his newest genocide as an act of bravery and patriotism, as did, by the way, the European colonizers. At the foundation of the necropolitical experiment underway in Brazil, we find a neoliberal project that envisions a world for a select few. Many are excluded and seen as undesirables in this program of social construction. This also applies to the elderly. Paulo Guedes, the Brazilian Minister of Economy, has expressed this project with clarity and great perversity, highlighting the economic advantages of having a population that dies younger and reduces the cost of social security, a topic widely discussed in Brazil in 2019 in light of a broad reform of pensions. Like many other social groups, the elderly become unwelcome, a cost, and a barrier to economic development. Deep down, there is a cleanup fantasy in terms of purely economic calculations. That's the price to be paid if we want to win the war. Some soldiers end up being sacrificed. Perhaps the great challenge of our times is to understand this new way of power functioning and try to change this process, not only in its constitutive dimension, platform capitalism and data politics, but also in its repressive dimension, the new authoritarianisms and necropolitics. We need an articulated effort of resistance in the global north and the global south, keeping in mind that these dynamics are widespread in the world in different ways, but without clear geographical boundaries. To do so, our main task consists in reinventing the public arena, fostering dialogue, regulating platforms, to stop or minimize surveillance capitalism, exploring new applications such as cooperative platforms, redesigning informational devices, promoting a solid digital and media literacy capable of training skilled, reflexive, and critical citizens in the emerging information society and surveillance culture, as well as reconnecting those who have been radically separated, remaking pacts, and preparing the ground for the construction of a shared world for everybody. In short, we have a long way ahead of us. It remains to be seen if we will have enough determination and mobilization to carry out this fight, and if we will be able to achieve these changes in time before we have to deal with conflicts, tragedies, and catastrophes of great proportions, perhaps the final ones for humankind. So I want to thank you very much. I apologize for taking so much time and for demanding so much of your patience. I also apologize for ending my presentation in such a pessimistic way. Sorry about that. And I remain at your disposal for the debate if there are any questions or considerations. Thanks.